Some families built empires. The Morgans built something far more powerful. They built a way to control uncertainty itself. In every major crisis of the early financial world, one name appeared where stability should have been. A name that didn't simply survive chaos, it organized it. Most dynasties controlled land, companies, or people. The Morgans controlled the one resource every government fears to lose: trust. And trust, when engineered correctly, is the most profitable form of power ever created. So the question isn't how the Morgans became powerful. The question is how they built a system that kept working long after the family disappeared from it. Before we continue, a disclaimer. This investigation is based entirely on publicly available information, archival records, verified reports, historical documents, and open-source data. Any references to rumors, speculation, or unconfirmed accounts are clearly identified as such. They are included only to show how perception shaped the legacy of this dynasty. This program does not promote, justify, or condemn any political, financial, or historical interpretation. The purpose is educational and analytical, to explore how systems of influence are built and how they continue operating long after the names behind them fade. You are encouraged to verify everything twice, cross-check the sources, and draw your own conclusions. Interpretation remains yours. Every dynasty begins with a story, but the Morgans didn't begin with wealth, land, or reputation. They began with something far more fragile: a promise. In the mid-1800s, before the name Morgan meant power, the financial world was a patchwork of unstable banks, inconsistent currencies, and unpredictable markets. Trust was scarce, credit was personal, and stability was something governments talked about but couldn't actually guarantee. Into this uncertainty stepped Junius Spencer Morgan, a quiet, disciplined banker who understood one truth that most of his rivals ignored. People don't invest in companies. They invest in confidence. He built a reputation brick by brick, slow, methodical, unglamorous, until his name became something rare at the time, a signal that a deal would not collapse. By the time his son, John Pierpont Morgan, took over, the foundation was already in place. A family whose value came not from what they owned, but from what others believed they could stabilize. This wasn't a dynasty built on conquest. It was a dynasty built on certainty, the one resource the world needed but couldn't produce. And that was the beginning of a system that would one day be larger than the family itself. Before the Morgans controlled capital, they controlled something even more valuable: information. In the 19th century, money moved slowly. Ships took weeks. Letters took days. Markets reacted long after events had already happened. But J.P. Morgan understood something that most bankers of his era dismissed as a novelty. Whoever receives information first controls the reaction. So while other financiers built vaults, Morgan built networks. He invested aggressively in telegraph lines, transatlantic cables, and high-speed communication routes, not because he cared about technology, but because every minute saved was an advantage that compounded into power. If a crisis erupted in Europe, Morgan knew before most American banks had even heard the rumors. If a company faltered, he could intervene hours or days before anyone else understood what was happening. And in a world where panic traveled faster than facts, the ability to move before the panic was almost a superpower. This was the moment. The Morgans stopped being just bankers and became something else: a private early warning system for the global financial world. By the late 1800s, J.P. Morgan had something no other financier possessed: a network fast enough to predict instability, and a reputation strong enough to anchor it. But information alone doesn't create power. To turn insight into control, Morgan needed a structure, a web that connected industries which had never been connected before. So he did something no banker had fully attempted. He unified the American economy. Railroads on the brink of collapse, Morgan reorganized them. Steel companies fighting each other into bankruptcy, Morgan merged them. Banks failing in chains, Morgan stabilized the entire chain at once. Piece by piece, he transformed fragmented industries into an ecosystem that depended on one central coordinating force, him. This wasn't philanthropy, and it wasn't ego. It was architecture. Morgan built a system where if one company wobbled, the others leaned in. If panic started in one sector, Morgan could contain it through another. He created a financial web that held the country together and placed himself directly at its center. Most dynasties control assets. Morgan controlled interdependence, and that made him indispensable. In 1907, the American financial system broke. Banks failed. Depositors panicked. Markets collapsed in waves that no institution could stop, except one. When the U.S. government had no functional central bank and the Treasury lacked the authority to intervene, the country turned to a private citizen, John Pierpont Morgan. He locked the most powerful bankers in his library, refused to let them leave, and forced them to agree on a rescue plan that stabilized the entire economy. No elections, no congressional approval, no public oversight. One man, one house, one decision that controlled the fate of millions. And it worked. Markets recovered. Banks reopened. Confidence returned. The public called him a savior. Some called him a tyrant. But the truth was simpler. In a moment of total instability, J.P. Morgan became the closest thing America had to a central bank. This was the turning point, the moment when a family dynasty became a financial infrastructure. From that day forward, crises didn't threaten Morgan's influence. They reinforced it. Because every new collapse proved the same lesson. The country needed the system he built more than it ever needed the man. By the early 1900s, the Morgans possessed something no law could regulate and no competitor could replicate, a reputation that replaced policy. When a company struggled, a single rumor that Morgan was involved could raise its value. When a bank faltered, the belief that Morgan might step in was often enough to calm depositors. He didn't always need to act. Most of the time, the idea of his intervention was enough to stabilize entire markets. That was the true power. Not money, not influence, but expectation. Governments negotiated differently when Morgan's name was in the room. Industrialists changed strategies because they anticipated his reaction. Even foreign powers treated him as something between an ally and a threat. And the more the world relied on his judgment, the less it trusted its own. This wasn't charisma. It wasn't mystique. It was the phenomenon every dynasty craves, but almost none achieve. A reputation so strong, it becomes a form of governance. By the time J.P. Morgan reached the height of his influence, something unusual had happened. The Morgan name no longer referred to a person. It referred to a function. Clients didn't ask for John Pierpont Morgan. They asked for the House of Morgan, as if it were a public institution, not a private family. The firm began to operate like a parallel financial government. It reviewed balance sheets of corporations that weren't its own. It advised national treasuries without holding public office. It stabilized markets without issuing a single regulation. And the world accepted it because the alternative was chaos. When Morgan died in 1913, something extraordinary occurred. nothing collapsed. His influence didn't evaporate. The system didn't fall apart. The network didn't dissolve. Because the power wasn't in the man. It was in the architecture he built and the dependency the country had developed on that architecture. The Morgans had achieved what very few dynasties accomplish. They replaced themselves before they even disappeared. If this story is making you see the structure differently, stay with it. There's another layer ahead. Subscribe to Dark Side Protocol to follow every investigation as it unfolds. And if you ever need a break from the silence and want satire instead, the link to Punchline Protocol is in the description. Mid-rolls are supposed to be loud. Ours aren't. Because if the audience made it this far, they don't need volume. They need a reminder that someone else is paying attention to the patterns they've always felt but never articulated. This project grows because of people like you, those who don't skip the quiet parts. Most dynasties build fortunes by owning things, land, factories, resources. The Morgans built theirs by owning certainty. In the early 20th century, the American economy was fragile, held together by short-term loans and unpredictable flows of capital. Everyone depended on credit. No one controlled it, except the Morgan system. J.P. Morgan didn't just lend money. He engineered credit as a structure, a way to stabilize industries and ensure they could not collapse without passing through his hands. When a railroad needed funding, Morgan didn't simply finance it. He restructured its board and reorganized its debts. When a steel company expanded too fast, he didn't punish it. He merged it into a larger entity that would depend on him even more. Over time, American industry became a pyramid built on one assumption. If something went wrong, Morgan would prevent disaster. And that belief allowed risky ventures, massive expansions, and national-scale projects that no government would dare to authorize. Morgan created a system where credit was not a tool. It was a governing principle, a silent architecture that held the country together. Every great financial empire has two stories, the one written in ledgers and the one written in consequences. The Morgans were no different. As their influence grew, an invisible network formed around them. Companies, banks, brokers, regional financiers, all connected not by contracts, but by dependency. Some institutions survived because they were close to the Morgan system. Others failed because they weren't. No laws, no threats, no explicit favoritism. Just the quiet gravity of a structure that pulled some actors in and let others drift into collapse. Historians call this the unofficial economy of influence, a parallel marketplace where access, stability, and survival were not determined by profits, but by proximity. Industry leaders adjusted strategies based on what they thought Morgan preferred. Banks avoided risks they believed Morgan would disapprove of. Politicians delayed reforms because they assumed the Morgan network would respond badly. This wasn't corruption. It wasn't conspiracy. It was the natural behavior of a system that had become large enough to shape outcomes simply by existing. And in that shadow, the Morgan dynasty gained something far more powerful than control: predictability. Everyone else acted as if the House of Morgan were watching. Every powerful family eventually becomes two things: a historical record and a legend built around the empty spaces inside it. The Morgans were no exception. The facts are clear. They rescued banks, stabilized industries, built financial structures that still exist today, and shaped the early architecture of American capitalism. But alongside the documented history grew something else, a narrative built from fear, admiration, and speculation. Some believed the Morgans were protectors who held the country together when its own institutions were too weak. Others were convinced they were architects of controlled instability, benefiting from crises that they alone could resolve. Both versions contain truth. Both versions contain distortion. The difficulty is this: when a dynasty becomes powerful enough that its actions affect entire systems, its reputation evolves faster than the facts. People see patterns even where none were intended. People see intention, even where there was only reaction. And people see manipulation even when the system simply followed its own momentum. In the end, the Morgan legacy exists somewhere between what they actually did and what the world needed to believe about them. Because when a family becomes a structure, the line between reality and myth is not just blurry, it becomes irrelevant. By the mid-20th century, something unusual happened. The Morgan name began to fade, but the Morgan system became stronger than ever. J.P. Morgan died in 1913. His son, J.P. Morgan Jr., took over, respected but not mythical. The world changed. Markets modernized. Governments expanded. New institutions rose. Old ones broke. And yet, through every transition, the same architecture remained in place. The Morgan logic of stability through dependency. Banks merged. Corporations reorganized. Regulations evolved. The original House of Morgan split into multiple entities. J.P. Morgan & Co., Morgan Stanley, and later parts of what would become the modern financial giants. The family name appeared less on buildings and more in the fine print of the global economy. But here's the paradox. The influence didn't shrink. It merely became distributed. The Morgan system dissolved into the bloodstream of finance, absorbed into institutions, policies, and frameworks that no longer required a family to guide them. The dynasty declined. The structure professionalized. The architecture became autonomous. Today, most people don't think of the Morgans when they talk about credit, markets, or financial stability, but they are still speaking the language the Morgans created. The name faded. The system remained. By the late 20th century, the Morgans had become something paradoxical, a dynasty with influence, but without presence. Their name was no longer attached to every major decision. Their heirs no longer commanded markets with a single gesture. There were no more midnight meetings in private libraries, no more emergency interventions, no more iconic public figures. And yet the system moved as if they were still here. Financial standards, credit protocols, stabilization strategies, risk management models all evolved along pathways first carved out by the Morgan approach. Even after the original House of Morgan dissolved, the financial world continued behaving as though the structure remained intact. Central banks adopted Morgan-style crisis response. Investment banks operated on Morgan-style hierarchies. Entire markets used Morgan-style assumptions about risk, panic, and confidence. This is the part of history that rarely feels real. A dynasty disappeared, but its logic survived. Influence without heirs, power without visibility, a system running on a framework that no longer needed the family that invented it. Most dynasties end when their last successor fades, but the Morgans created a form of influence that didn't require anyone to inherit it. The system became the successor. Every dynasty leaves something behind. Some leave buildings. Some leave institutions, some leave books, movements, scandals. But the Morgans left something far more difficult to see and nearly impossible to measure: a way of perceiving risk. Before them, risk was considered a danger to be avoided. After them, risk became a resource, a tool that could be priced, traded, merged, or redistributed. They reshape the global understanding of crisis, not as a failure of the system, but as a moment the system could exploit to reinvent itself. They transformed credit from a personal agreement into a structural pillar of modern economies. They influenced governments, not through treaties or elections, but through the quiet expectation that markets would behave according to rules they helped design. And their greatest legacy of all is the one most people never notice: the belief that financial stability requires a central authority, even when that authority is not the state. That idea survives today in institutions that no longer carry the Morgan name, yet operate on the same underlying logic: crisis, coordination; panic, intervention; instability, architecture. This is the final layer of the Morgan dynasty. Not wealth, not influence, not reputation, perception. A narrative so deeply rooted in global finance that it persists long after the family itself faded into the background. The Morgan dynasty did something unusual. They built a system strong enough to survive without them. A structure that absorbed crises, reshaped markets, and defined what stability meant long after the family name stopped appearing on the doors. Today, that system continues to function, smoothly, silently, distributed across institutions that no longer remember where the architecture came from. And that leaves us with one question, the only one that matters. If the dynasty is gone, who inherited the system? Is it controlled? Is it leaderless? Is it guided by invisible hands, or simply moving forward on the momentum of decisions made a century ago? We may never know, because the deeper the structure, the quieter the truth. And in the world the Morgans left behind, some systems don't need names to shape the future. If this story changed the way you see systems, there's more waiting for you here. Subscribe to Dark Side Protocol for the next investigation, every Wednesday. And if you want satire instead of silence, you'll find a link to Punchline Protocol in the description. Interpretation remains yours. And for those who look for the layers that don't make it into the public archive, you'll know where to find them.